In this news roundup of the week for March the 8th, 2024, Ukraine depends on the support of the EU in its war with Russia, so why is it due to get hammered by the bloc over net zero policies? America's SEC brings in new rules for corporations to report on their greenhouse gas emissions and risk exposure to climate change, and it marks the start of an extended fight back. And President Joe Biden kicks the presidential campaign into high gear with a combative State of the Union speech. But is it going to make the slightest difference to the result? Let's discuss. The outcome of the war in Ukraine remains as up in the air as ever, but one thing that seems highly likely, which is that however it finally concludes, it is going to be the case that the country will be limping into the next stage of its history, seriously degraded. Russia will not willingly pay reparations so long as Putin is in charge, at least you would presume, and while some of Russia's frozen assets abroad might ultimately, after some legal process or another, be channeled to Ukraine, it will still be significantly below what's needed. Still, at least Ukraine will be able to rely on its European allies, you would presume. Well, a piece in Politico this week highlighted a growing concern in Ukraine that actually it's likely to get hit hard by EU net zero carbon rules. I mean, really hard. This comes from a pending tax in the EU that it's been bringing in for some time, whereby carbon-intensive imports such as iron and steel will be targeted aggressively if they come from countries with less stringent environmental rules. This is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It aims to protect EU producers who incur the costs of reducing pollution from simply then losing all their business to cheap imports from people who don't have to have such costs. China, unsurprisingly, is not a fan and has filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization, which seemed unlikely to succeed. India is also unhappy and has threatened to retaliate with a tax on historical pollution that would target European firms. But Ukraine equally is a major producer of iron and steel. And because of the war, Ukraine has had to double down on its previous dependency on European exports and its markets within Europe for its iron and steel. Now, for some reason, Ukraine has been too busy in the last couple of years to take moves to decarbonise its industrial base. And hence it is in the crosshairs for when the EU law takes effect in 2026. Around the time that one at least would hope that the country is starting to rebuild its shattered economy. Analysts say that Ukraine's massive exposure on this means that it stands to lose something like $1.4 billion. Now, there is a potential loophole. There's a force majeure or act of God clause for exceptional circumstances. And although Vladimir Putin fits no one's imagining of the embodiment of God, the war might still be taken as qualifying. But Brussels hasn't given any indications that it is planning to offer Ukraine an exemption. So far, Ukraine hasn't complained. I mean, you wouldn't when you depend on European military aid to try and fight off the people trying to take over your country. But as you would expect, the war has been taking its toll on the performance of one of its most valuable industries. So in 2022, exports of steel fell from over 20 million metric tons the previous year to just 6.5. Vital trading routes via the Black Sea have been disrupted by Russia's naval blockades for all of Ukraine's success in hitting some key targets in that area. This led to Ukraine's dependence on the European market to double from where it had been, up to about 85% of its exports. Now, of course, some people argue that Ukraine is on the accession path to joining the EU, which means that it would be working gradually to implement EU laws anyway, and it will become an insider, a member of the club. Unless, of course, whatever settlement that is finally reached in the conclusion of the war rules out such an accession, which it might, because we just don't know. The point is that if a threat isn't being treated as an urgent issue, which it doesn't seem to be, then the coming EU elections, expected to make significant changes in the makeup of the elected chamber, and by extension the national representatives in the executive, This may mean it all gets pushed back for an extended period of time, with a more uncertain outcome. Caught between this rock and a hard place, Ukraine is currently promising that it will try to avoid the problem by bringing its industry up to EU standards by 2026, although that's a big ask. Since exemption is, in the words of a Ukrainian environment minister, not on the table, it is planning to adopt a pilot version of the EU's carbon pricing system. This would force its companies to pay for carbon pollution and raise prices for Ukrainian manufacturers. Not an easy process during a war, you would think, and hence expected to take significantly longer than the period before the new rules come in. One iron and steel consultant told Politico that it would take Ukraine at least a dozen years to make its carbon price the same as that in Europe. So the key years, when Ukraine is trying to survive and to rebuild its economy, they would be saddled with years of higher tariffs on most of its exports and hence lower revenue. And as Ukrainian steel becomes too expensive for the EU, ironically the volumes would probably be made up by sources much further away, creating rather more emissions via the long-distance shipping process. It wouldn't be the first time unintended consequences have flowed from complex EU legislation. Indeed, some would argue it's kind of what they're famous for. But it's certainly likely a pretty egregious consequence if nothing is done pretty quickly to sort it out. Now, the next story might strike some as very similar to that one, others less so much. All depends on your perspective. America's Securities and Exchange Commission has brought in a new rule for the top public companies to start reporting details about the climate risks they face, the cost to them of severe weather events, and their greenhouse gas emissions. The rule, which sparked spirited resistance, shall we say, from a number of corporate lobbyists and Republican lawmakers, represents one of the biggest changes in US corporate reporting requirements in a number of years. Now, it had undergone a certain amount of whittling down under pressure. Most substantively, the requirement for companies to report what is referred to as their scope-free emissions was abandoned. Now, in terms of corporate emissions and the jargon that's grown up around them, Scope 1 emissions are the things that you directly create. Scope 2 emissions are those generated by the energy you use. However, Scope 3 emissions are then all the other ones that are generated at any point in your process. So the extraction of the raw materials you use, the operations of your suppliers, and indeed any emissions produced by your customers when they use your product. All of that's rather hard and costly to measure, as you can imagine, and even harder to actually influence what the emissions might be. I mean, not impossible, but really hard. Those last ones now are not covered. It's not likely to wholly mollify the measure's opponents, and although it's supposed to start to come into effect in 2025, at the very least you can expect it will be mired in the courts for somewhat longer than that. Indeed, just hours after the bill was approved, 9 Republican-led states announced plans to take the rule to court. Critics make the case that it's not the SEC's place to bring in this sort of requirement, worrying about climate change in the absence of Congress legislating that they should. It is simply beyond their remit. Of course, there are equally some supporters of the original, stronger proposal who are now bent out of shape with the watering down moves. The environmental NGOs the Sierra Club and Earth Justice have said that they are considering challenging the move for its, quote, arbitrary removal of key provisions. The supporters of the rule argue that it's just the obvious next step in the SEC's push for more corporate disclosure, with more information about the risks faced by companies being of benefit to shareholders. Many corporations, however, are complaining that it's the kind of legislation that politicians find easy to pass without really engaging in the huge and costly bureaucracy that they're forcing onto the companies who are, after all, the drivers of the economy. The highly revered investor Warren Buffett has famously complained that while he fully expects his people who are running the businesses he invests in, and his own business of course, to, quote, do the right thing, the process of spending millions to collect data and report it on multiple measures decided by some committee or another. That, he says, doesn't help that process in the slightest. Now, he may be right, he may be wrong, it may be an excuse, but it's certainly an indicator that there will be plenty of fights left in this issue over the coming years. Of course, one factor that might play its part is the US presidential election, still wending its dreary way as we approach polling day, which is still a very long way away. This week saw the Joe Biden State of the Union address, where commentators seemed largely agreed that one of his big challenges was to put in a dynamic performance, to put to rest all of those criticisms about him being too old to stand again for the presidency. This follows some frankly ridiculous discussions where some Democrat figures have been telling interviewers how dynamic and focused and razor-sharp old Joe is when they've seen him in action behind the scenes. Yes, he may forget what he was talking about, fall downstairs and generally bump into things in public, but in private, he's a living human dynamo. You don't have to be a Trump supporter to think that's somewhat insulting the intelligence of the average American. Nevertheless, it was clearly the brief for this speech that Biden be energetic, sharp and combative, and through whatever process of preparation it took, it's pretty much what he delivered. I don't pay much heed to the Republican critique of this, that it was much more partisan than the norm and hence a, quote, utter disgrace. I mean, I agree the State of the Union should aim to be non-partisan, but at least try to be a bit consistent, because, you know, your man Trump wasn't exactly famous for his non-partisan, statesman-like State of the Union addresses either. So, yes, Biden objectively gave a competent speech and some effective off-the-cuff moments in response to heckling, which is where you might have anticipated the biggest danger moments for him. Now, does it make the slightest difference? Well, probably not. I mean, maybe if he could sustain that level for the entire election campaign, it might do. But that is, I would suggest, quite a big ask. It's like, yes, the brief was that he should provide a normal, energetic and effective speech. He largely did that, but people are still entitled to ask, when did we set the bar so low that that was what we were looking for? And that's the key. It's kind of like the UK political scene at the moment. For an extended period of time, people like me were just saying, for the love of God, can we please just have people in charge who are basically competent? People who don't bump into things all the time and knock the furniture over with their elbows. And then we kind of got that when Rishi Sunak took over. But the Tories are still on course for the election drubbing of their worst nightmares whenever that event finally happens. Why? Because basic competence is a prerequisite, but it isn't on its own sufficient. The Tory party remains jaded, tired, devoid of ideas, still too susceptible to a vocal fringe element that would veer the party to the absurd given half a chance. And so while Sunak fixed some of the most egregious things that have been wrong with his party's chaotic performance, it has not given him the slightest credit in the polls. Now, politics is brutal like that sometimes. It's not over till it's over, of course. Last-minute changes of fortune have happened in the past, rare though they are. In the US, Biden still has a hill to climb. The economy is broadly doing well, but nobody gives him credit for that. I'm not sure how much credit American presidents at all should ever take for factors that are largely out of their control, but obviously the economy can be pivotal at certain moments in history. At the same time, he has upset some of his own supporters with his position in relation to Israel and Gaza. Whether because of that or other factors, he's consistently polling behind Trump in most of the key swing states. It could all change, but since Democrat-motivated figures have been making Trump more popular by pursuing him in the courts in ways that look to a lot of people like politically motivated persecution, and since the core of Biden's appeal for the next 4 years is that he remains not Trump, and that should be enough, Well, right now it's hard to see what will change. The forlorn hope that some Democrats had that legal action would succeed in kicking Trump off the ballot, well, that was put to rest as widely predicted this week by the Supreme Court. On the plus side, the court ruled on the matter unanimously, which was one of the two prerequisites I identified to try to not have everything explode in the immediate aftermath. It was noteworthy that in spite of the unanimity, a number of Democrat commentators nevertheless railed bitterly against the decision, saying that the court had to be dissolved since it had failed its job so woefully. Phew! Imagine what they would have said if it had gone down party lines rather than being unanimous. But on the minor side, the court did not specifically state that Trump did not count as an insurrectionist. It only said that that was a matter for Congress. Now, unless I missed something, that could potentially lead to the explosive outcome that I discussed recently, which is that if Democrats take the House, they could rule post-election that he is an insurrectionist and refuse to confirm the election results if he won the ballot. That is one of the big nightmare scenarios if you'd prefer that the US didn't play out that civil war thing. Well, all of that's something to look forward to. But back to the election and the fact that Biden is facing an uphill battle to win it. Trump could potentially change that by stepping on his own chances in a way that he often did during the 2020 election, for instance. If the election is about Biden, it's likely that Trump will win. If the election is about Trump, well, it's at least possible that Biden will win. And generally, Trump's problem has always been that he can't cope with any situation where it's not all about him. But so far, this time, he is showing a great deal more campaign discipline than he demonstrated in any other previous contest. Who will crack first? And will it make a decisive difference? That is the dismal equation that Americans will be dealing with for the next 6 months. I mean, my condolences on that, but I was saying years ago that your main job was to get 2 different candidates to choose from. But would you listen? My thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, without that support, I could not make these videos. If you would like to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.